this episode of In the Loop, Euphoria, House of the Dragon, White Lotus, step aside. HBO Max has a new show getting viewers to tune in. So, can it keep up with the hype? We look at the newest TV show adapted from a video game. Plus, we've got some vaccine news for you, but this isn't about a COVID booster. We'll give you an inside look at the first vaccine for bees.
Nobody has ever thought about vaccination before in insect systems, but we have shown that we can also vaccinate insects without antibody-based systems.
This is In the Loop. I'm Christian Bryant. We'll get to those stories in a few, but first, it's no secret that the past few years have been hard on our planet as it deals with the increasing effects of climate change. When it comes to weather extremes and how that can and has impacted us, it's not just damage to infrastructure we have to worry about. For example, extreme heat events have been shown to trigger heat strokes, while extreme cold can cause heart attacks. In fact, recent research has shown that about 1 in 100 heart disease fatalities are linked to extreme weather events. But there are also impacts that are harder to observe, but just as noteworthy. One example is climate anxiety, which is affecting a growing number of Americans.
Climate anxiety specifically refers to the environmental damage and human toll that will be brought on and already is being brought on by climate change itself, a really specific environmental problem. It touches a lot of different environmental issues, but it is more specifically around climate change.
That's Sarah Jaquette Ray, chair of the Environmental Studies Department at Cal Poly Humboldt and author of A Field Guide to Climate Anxiety. The book focuses on the effects of climate change on late millennials and Generation Z Americans. Ray calls them the climate generation.
We think about the generation that was raised under the shadow of 9/11, or the generation that was raised thinking about gun violence, or the generation from my parents' generation, the Vietnam War. There's sort of always a sort of big set of threats or risks that define a particular historical generation. And the climate generation is the generation that grew up being told by the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change that they only had 10 to 12 years left to reverse the worst impacts of climate change.
More than 2/3 of Americans experience some climate anxiety, according to the American Psychological Association. Another survey found that 84% of children and young adults from ages 16 to 25 are at least moderately worried about climate change, and 59% of them would say they are very or extremely worried. Young people are the ones who are supposed to inherit this planet, but they're worried that there won't be much planet to inherit. And those worries are not unfounded. In 2021, UNICEF estimated that at least 1 billion children are at extremely high risk to feel the effects of climate change, both the physical and mental toll. That's especially true for children in the Central African Republic, Nigeria, and Guinea. Stateside, many Americans have gone so far as to avoid having children because they fear their kids would bear the brunt of climate change. In recent years, many developing countries have been the hardest hit by climate disasters, with long and challenging recovery times hurting their prospects to bounce back and work to prevent future disasters. Think of last year's catastrophic flooding in Pakistan. The disaster affected more than 30 million people, and experts say it could take more months, if not years, for Pakistan to recover. Developing countries often blame Western nations like the US for the historical emissions, claiming the climate challenges they face are a consequence of our past recklessness with emissions. Many studies support these claims and show that while climate change is a global problem, the effects are not equally distributed.
People who are closer to climate disasters, things that will be impacted much more greatly by climate change, those are people who are already existing in structures of oppression. So people who are living on the front lines of environmental vulnerability, the people who are going to be on the lowest lying nations of the world, people who are already close to environmental problems like siting of incinerators or other forms of toxicity.
Here in the US, studies have found that Black, Latinx, Native American, and other economic and racial minority groups in America are disproportionately impacted by climate change compared to their white counterparts. Chronic stress can take a huge toll on people, and research shows climate anxiety may affect the risk of developing depression, anxiety, and even substance use disorders. So, how exactly can we counter climate anxiety? Experts like Ray say the answer lies in how we think about the problem of climate change.
We often think of climate change as such a big problem and ourselves as too small or too powerless to do anything about it. And that is really going to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. And so perceiving ourselves as far more powerful than we think ourselves to be, and perceiving the problem of climate change as much more touchable, those two things in tandem would do sort of right size the problem and allow us to feel more empowered to grapple with it.
Experts also suggest talking about your anxiety, spending time in nature, supporting environmental organizations if you can afford to, and making lifestyle changes based on your values can help ease the sense of helplessness that often drives climate anxiety. To give us a better idea of ways to cope with climate anxiety and climate change related health issues, we're joined by Kim Knowlton of the National Resources Defense Council. Kim is a senior scientist at the organization and helps strengthen health preparedness in communities across the world that are trying to adapt to the changing climate. Kim, thank you so much for joining us on In the Loop. Let's just jump right in. Research is increasingly confirming a link between climate change and adverse mental health outcomes. Many experts would argue we already have a mental health crisis here in the U.S. that needs addressing. How exactly is climate change impacting that issue?
You're touching on a really important question, Christian, and thank you for having me on to talk about this. Climate change is fueling a whole host of extreme weather events, from heat waves to more wildfires to more droughts, and at the same time, more extreme rainfall events and flooding. And people who are exposed to extreme weather events are at increased risk of worsening some of those ailments, some really important harms to mental health, like anxiety, depression, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and even suicide. So the connections between climate change and not only our physical health, but our mental health are unfortunately very strong and extremely varied.
Globally, I know that your recent work has involved a focus on India. Research has shown a bleak outlook for the country, with experts saying parts of India may become uninhabitable for humans if emissions aren't curbed and heat waves don't come under control. Can you tell us more about how developing nations like India are being affected by climate change, and what exactly are the health implications we're seeing there?
Low and middle income countries, India among them, really are on the front lines of a lot of these climate impacts and impacts to health, both physical and mental health. A lot of people in those countries don't have the economic resources to get out of harm's way when those extreme weather events like heat waves, like flooding hit, and nor to adapt ahead of time. It's quite serious. There's been some scholarship that has found in the last 30 years in India, the country we're talking about, over 60,000 farmers have committed suicide in the last 30 years associated with extreme heat and drought that really limits their ability to provide for themselves and their families. And the mental health impacts of that are so extreme that people have actually taken their own lives in those kind of numbers. That is a really, obviously, a huge, terrible burden. And unfortunately, mental health is less than 1% of international health aid. So we really have a ways to go in helping the international community.
You know, we're no experts at curbing emissions here in the U.S. Last June, the Supreme Court dealt a major blow to the Environmental Protection Agency's power to regulate carbon emissions. You wrote about that decision and its impact on public health as well. Which communities are especially vulnerable in America to decisions like that?
In the case West Virginia versus EPA, which was a setback, but definitely not a death blow to the effort to curb greenhouse gases. Black and brown communities of color, economically disadvantaged communities. So there's an unequal access to healthcare, to affordable housing, to public transportation systems, to good sustainable jobs. Those folks are really already suffering health burdens. And when extreme weather events hit, they are typically put in harm's way to a much higher degree than other people, other communities. And for sure, we can be thinking about directing our climate preparedness and our climate health preparedness to serve those people first and best.
I want to take a deep breath on this topic because anxiety is a pretty major issue here. Anxiety about the climate is a growing issue, especially among younger people. How can viewers who are concerned about climate change deal with their anxiety? You know, where's the best place to begin when the problem is so huge?
So the things that occur to me are, one, we are not alone in a sense of anxiety or concern about climate change and its effects on our health, our family's health, and global health. It's been estimated in polls by the American Psychiatric Association that, in fact, over 50% of Americans share that experience of anxiety about how climate change is going to affect their health and the planet. So I think it's quite potent to realize that we are not alone and that paying heed to that anxiety is, in fact, really healthy. Even grief has been widely identified at the loss of beautiful landscapes, natural resources, community security, our health. So acknowledging that grief at deep loss, I think, is honest and really important. It can serve to bind a community of people who literally are in the millions around the world. A sense of community I find to be one of what I call my 3 C's: community, compassion. I want to listen and learn from people locally and around the world. And then courage. We need to have the courage to demand action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions that are causing climate change, to demand health protections for the people most in harm's way. So courage, compassion, and community are part of what really keep me going every day.
We really did a pendulum swing here with this conversation, talking about all of the negative impacts of climate change to, you know, you giving us some words of wisdom to live by. I'm glad you're giving us these gems. Kim Knowlton is the senior scientist at the NRDC. Thank you so much for joining us on In the Loop.
You're very welcome. Thank you, Christian. Nice talking with you.
Before we move into our next story, it's worth noting that when it comes to feeling the effects of climate change, there are also reasons for hope. Take the recovery of the ozone layer, for example. We reported the good news about it slowly but noticeably healing last week. In less than 45 years, it could be as good as new. And I know that sounds like a long time, but it's still good news for future generations. There have also been increasing efforts to help many animals on the brink of extinction. And these efforts have already helped many nearly extinct animal species like snow leopards, tigers, humpback whales, and rhinos. These rebounds show that we are making progress on some fronts, slowly but surely. And although it might be hard to see the smoke-filled forest for the trees, seriously, it's not all doom and gloom. Okay, folks, up next, we're looking at how a change in population trends could have big impacts in China and why new gender laws in Scotland are facing challenges. Those stories are right after this quick break, so see you in a few.